I have a prayer space that I go to every day. I've been going there for the last 11 years, and many of you who have been to my home have probably seen it or sat with me there at some point. And if you haven't, I invite you to come and do that one day. And when I go there, it's a respite. It makes me remember who I am. It also makes me remember what I commit to being. And on this space, I keep one prayer. Only one prayer. And there are so many prayers, right, in the world. But it's that prayer that we heard in the interlude, the prayer known as the prayer of St. Francis. Because I just don't have one that strikes home to me as much as that. Mother Teresa recited this prayer every day. Margaret Thatcher cited it upon becoming the Prime Minister of Britain. It's also included in the 12-step book of Alcoholics Anonymous, of AA. But St. Francis did not write this prayer. The author is anonymous, but it was first, history shows that it was first printed, actually, in a newsletter in 1912. And it was during World War I, when people were aching for peace and needed a peace prayer. So what better song or prayer to take us into a conversation about the extraordinary St. Francis of Assisi? So I'd like to share a little bit about the life of St. Francis. Believe me, this is condensed because I could talk about St. Francis for 2 hours. So the man who would become St. Francis of Assisi was born in 1182, and he died at the age of 44 in 1226. His father was a prominent silk merchant who traveled all throughout Europe. These were times in Europe where merchants and money and exchanging of money and wealth was becoming a larger and larger experience that separated people very much. So Francis's baptismal, I want to give you a little background. Francis's baptismal name was Giovanni. But because of his traveling with his father through France, he loved France, they started calling him Little France, Little Francesco. So Francis became his nickname and his name he was known by through his life. He was a very charismatic and playboy kind of young man. He lived a rich life. He had lots of women in his life, lots of music and song and jokes and parties. That was the life of Francis as a young guy. But a war broke out in Assisi, and of course all the young men went to war. And Francis was captured, and when he was captured, he was imprisoned in a dungeon for about a year, where he became very, very ill. And upon his release, he left a very different man than he was before he went to war, and he returned. After approximately a year. He was broken, but you might say he was actually broken open. Right? And at some point he wandered into a chapel in the area, and when he was in there, he felt the crucifix above the altar speak to him and say to him, "Francis, I need you to rebuild my church." And he thought that in this vision he had, he thought, wow, this church is really a mess. I better start rebuilding this church. But eventually he realized that the church that he was invited to rebuild was the whole church. Not this a brick and mortar, but the experience of Christianity. So Francis continued to change. He separated himself from his father and his merchant. Being a merchant, there's a whole story to that, which I could share at another time. And Francis was that guy that was terrified of lepers. If he knew there was a leper colony, he stayed 2 miles away from them. And he held his nose. But after his awakening, he would walk over to the lepers, wrap his arms around them, hug them, clean their wounds, and kiss their hands. And he would say that in kissing their hands, what was bitter became sweet. He took on a life of poverty and begged for his meals and preached. And people started to follow him because the thing about Francis is that he was so authentic. You know, he wasn't just a guy standing in front preaching that had gone to study religion. He followed the religion of his heart, and he preached the gospel as he knew it. And so off he wandered, and people felt this truth that was living in Francis, and they followed him. And they followed him. And eventually, he developed a significant following of people from all different walks of life who would sit with him and live with him in the woods and beg as well. And eventually, because he was preaching, he had to go and meet with the Pope to get an approval by him to preach, because you couldn't just walk around and preach, which he did. And it was pretty interesting because the Pope wouldn't usually recognize somebody like him, a barefoot beggar, coming into the church. But yet the Pope saw something sacred he saw the true sacredness in Francis. And Francis, even though this Pope, I think his name was Innocent, Pope Innocent was his name, strange name. And he, in his opulence and all his wealth, Francis saw the sacredness in the Pope. And this unusual bond happened. And he was blessed and given the right to go and preach. Ultimately, the Franciscan order began to evolve. And through many years of preaching, it just continued to grow to hundreds and thousands. And so Francis lived his life. And at some point, and I'm not going to go into every bit of his life, of course, because we just don't have enough time, but during the Crusades, I think it was the Third Crusade, he went on his own on a pilgrimage. He's older and he's kind of ill at this point, to meet with the Sultan of the Islamic infidels, as they would probably consider them, and engage them to stop fighting. But when he got there, all his ideas of what this Sultan was and what Islam was were changed, because the Sultan was an extraordinary man, decent and good and educated, and invited him to come and sit with him and study with him, and he invited him to preach to him and invited him to stay for weeks. And this beautiful relationship ensued between Francis and the Sultan. And if you'd love to know more about this very, very beautiful story, there is a Hollywood movie called The Sultan and the Saint. You could Google it, catch it on Amazon, pay $2.99, and you can catch it, and I recommend it. It's very good. It's been several years since I watched it, but it's clear that the story stayed with me.
The Sultan and the Saint.
The Sultan and the Saint. Francis eventually made his way back to Assisi. But when he came back, he found that his followers had gone on a whole nother direction and did not follow his teachings of poverty anymore. They went off and did their own thing. And essentially, they went in a different direction than St. Francis. St. Francis began to lose his sight, and he became ill. He developed leprosy. And he also was the first person known to have developed the stigmata, if you know what the stigmata is. Those are the scars that Jesus would have had from the crucifixion. So he developed scars on the center of his hands, centers of his feet, and on his side. And they say the stigmata continues to bleed, never stops really, just an oozing of blood. And he passed away at 44. But he left the world very different, even though his direct followers did not do things exactly the way he wanted. His teachings stayed alive. So you notice the name of this talk was, this is part one of a two-part talk. This week is about the fact that St. Francis was the patron saint of ecology. And next week we're going to talk about the blessing of the animals. We're going to have a blessing of the animals. It's going to be on Zoom and in person. I'm going to invite you to my garden. Bring your pets. But that's next week. So why was St. Francis proclaimed the patron saint of ecology? It's recognized that St. Francis saw the interconnectedness of nature and spirit. Many people point to his well-known writing called the Canonical of Brother Sun and Sister Moon. And I'd like to share a little bit of this reading with you now. I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's kind of long. But you'll get a sense of how alternative Francis was to most traditional preachers. And these are his words. And I'll invite you, any of you that are triggered or uncomfortable with the word Lord, to consider the word spirit or all that is. Praise be with you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Brother Sun, who is the day through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor. Of you most high he bears the likeness. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars in the heavens. You have made them bright, precious, and fair. Praise be you, my Lord, through brothers wind and air, and fair and stormy all weather moods by which you cherish all that you have made. Praise be you, my Lord, through Sister Water, so useful, humble, precious, and pure. Praise be you, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you light the night. He is beautiful, playful, and robust and strong. Praise be you, my Lord, through Sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, producing varied fruits and colored flowers and herbs. In 1979, Pope John Paul II declared St. Francis the patron saint of ecologists. And in some ways, St. Francis of Assisi could be viewed as the original Earth Day advocate. He not only did he care for the poor and the sick, but he preached sermons on animals and wanted all the creatures on earth, including humans, to be treated as equals under God. Many of his sermons included animals and birds, and in some cases, he preached directly to animals and birds. We'll talk more about that next week. Francis not only preached about the interrelatedness of all of the earth, he lived in this relationship with the interrelatedness of the earth and all its creatures and all of spirit. This call to ecology is not specific to St. Francis or Christianity. All religions have calling for us to be sovereigns of this planet and all their creatures. So this information I'm going to share with you now was sourced from the UN Environmental Program. Welcome, Liz. We live in a time where science and religion are often thought of as being at odds on many issues. On the question of environment, however, there is widespread agreement across spiritual traditions acknowledging our individual responsibility. All faiths acknowledge the need for environmental stewardship. I'm repeating this because we have a new guest. And as to be caretakers of the earth. And so here are some quotes to share. The Dalai Lama said that our ancestors viewed the earth as rich and bountiful, which it is. And many people in the past also saw it as inexhaustibly sustainable, which we know now it is not, only if we care for it. Eastern Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, you got to allow us Eastern Orthodox in here, right? Right, Emmett? We must treat nature with the same awe and wonder that we reserve for human beings. And we do not need this insight in order to believe in God or prove his existence. All we need to do is breathe it. Simply be in it, be with it. Guru Amma, has anybody heard of Amma? She's fantastic. Shares that there's an inseparable bond between man and nature, for man cannot be in existence if removed from nature. Islam shares, devote thyself single-mindedly to your faith and follow nature which is designed by Allah. In Jewish tradition, there is an all-encompassing principle called Tikkun Olam, which basically is the call to be part of the healing of humanity and restoring the world's wholeness. So in recent years, environmentalism has been receiving growing support from leaders of religious traditions. I attended the Parliament of World's Religions in 2018 or 19. Liz, you remember when I went? When was that? Around then, right? At this parliament, so much of the focus of 10,000 religious leaders from all over the earth was on the environment. They realized in coming together that our collective intentions can really make a difference in shifting this planet and hopefully allowing it to live forward for our ancestors. The Dalai Lama shared in 2020 that Buddha would be green and urged his followers to reduce the environmental impact. And people from all the traditions that joined us had that same intention. This last week, though, has been a tough week for the environment. And I'd like to share with you little bits of articles I've read in either the Washington Post or the Guardian, which is where I tend to go for a lot of news sources. And I'm sorry, this might not be uplifting, but speaking truth is not always uplifting. Sharing things that are true. So they reported, and I think it was the Guardian, that nearly half of the planet's bird species are in decline. And this is according to the current State of the World Bird Report. It shows that the intensification of agriculture is putting pressure on 73% of the species. Logging, invasive species exploitation of natural resources, and climate breakdowns are the other main threats. With our concern for the environment, you would hope that globally we would be moving towards more sustainable energy, right? But currently, more than 24,000 kilometers of pipeline is in development around the Earth. And those are oil and gas pipelines. And these release carbon dioxide, I believe. I'm not the expert on that, and I didn't write down all the details. But our goal is to limit global warming to 1.5 Celsius and this would put us at odds with it. The countries that are leading these projects are the United States, Russia, China, and India. And we can't end this week without discussing the hurricanes Fiona and Ian and the devastation they both left in their wake. We're all aware of the increase in intensity and frequency of hurricanes that are impacting the U.S. 9 Category 4 hurricanes have hit the mainland in the past 50 years. 50 years. 6 were just the past 5 years. What's that tell us? The primary reason we're seeing this shift is that storms draw their strength and power from the heat in the ocean. So all the large amounts of extra heat we've been adding is like adding fuel to the fire. The ocean actually draws on that heat. More than 90% of the excess heat from man-made global heating over the past 5 decades is absorbed by the ocean. 90% of man-made heat, global heating, is absorbed by the ocean. Isn't that intense?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I know many of us watch public television and listen to NPR. Am I right? Yes.
Only.
That's the audience only, yeah. But it's not unusual for corporate media to downplay or ignore climate crisis, right? Most news media, and the reason's not difficult to discern. Most news media is controlled by corporations who have a financial interest in sustaining business as usual, right? So if governments act to prevent global warming, then business models will have to change. These changes would disfavor corporations. To keep shareholders and advertisers happy, these topics are neglected or at least whitewashed. So it's interesting how our news sources are controlled, right? So the 7th UU principle, we have 8 principles in the UU, is the respect for the interdependent web of all existence in which we are a part. And this is a direct call to action for our environment. If that's our principle, that's our call to action. Most of us, well, let me just back up. These are difficult things to talk about and are frightening. I think it is for me. And most of us don't even know what to do or where to start to take action. So perhaps we could have a conscious conversation this Thursday evening. This will be on Zoom at 7 o'clock. And we can unpack this together as a congregation, talk about ways that we can be in action in our lives. Sound good? Mm-hmm. All right. Last week, Reverend Pippa closed her extraordinary service. I hope you had a chance to see it. It's on Zoom if you missed it. With a quite profound quote by Rabbi Amichai from Lab Shul, who's extraordinary. I've heard him speak many times. And I think it would be valuable for us to close our service again with this same reading. And since this is the week where we celebrate New Year, the Jewish New Year, let us do it again. In this new year before us, let us rise in our roles as co-creators of a healthy, healing ecosystem of sacred, sustainable, and systematic love and justice. May it be so. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.